Alice McDermott is the author of 9 novels that get passed hand to hand and generation to generation. She's one of the best-loved fiction writers of our time. She's also one of the great explorers of Catholic and Irish-American experience and of the universally human experience of making sense of our moral impulses, our inclinations to do good things and bad things, the miracle and hardship of motherhood and daughterhood, the astonishment of finding love, our loyalty to family and our rejection of family, and our struggles to find self-worth and purpose in life. She received the National Book Award for her novel Charming Billy. She was a finalist for the National Book Award for the novel That Night. She's a 3-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. There aren't many of those walking the earth. Born in Brooklyn, she grew up on Long Island, where she attended Catholic schools in Elmont and Hempstead. She earned her bachelor's degree at SUNY Oswego. In the afternoon session, people clapped for SUNY Oswego. Absolution, her 9th novel, is an amazing book. It fills a hole, a gap in our imaginings of the American historical experience, an absence that you did not realize was missing. The lives of American military wives and corporate wives and CIA wives and their families in the early 1960s in Vietnam, in the build-up to the Vietnam War. That little world is a revelation, as are the characters, the women who inhabit it. Women trapped in the conventional roles of women at the time, wives and mothers who live in the orbits of their very important husbands, on the periphery of global politics, organizing cocktail parties and charitable fundraisers, playing tennis, and trying to be do-gooders in a country of real misery, grotesque inequality, poverty, violence, and disease. And shallow though we might imagine them to be, these women are marvelously complicated, sublimating their stifled ambitions and their unrecognized brilliance into their philanthropic ventures and their intricate social relationships. You had no idea that you wanted to befriend these people, to know these people in this remote time and place, that you needed to know them. But that's one of the amazing things this novel accomplishes. Please join me in welcoming Alice McDermott.
Thank you. Didn't bring a book.
So Alice will give us a reading, which was wonderful to hear this in her voice. So we're looking forward to that.
Thank you, and thank you for the wonderful introduction. Thank you for being here. I can't believe it was 1992, the first time I was here. And what an honor to have the great William Kennedy in the audience, a writer who made me want to be a writer, and in his kindness made me feel that I must be a writer if I've been in his presence. I'm just going to read from the opening pages of Absolution so I don't have to explain too much, and we can get to our conversation. There were so many cocktail parties in those days. And when they were held in the afternoon, we called them garden parties. But they were cocktail parties nonetheless. You have no idea what it was like for us, the women, I mean, the wives. Most days I would bathe in the morning and then stay in my house coat until lunch, reading, writing letters home, those fragile, pale blue airmail letters with their complex folds, evidence, I think now, of how exotic distance itself once seemed. I'd do my nails, compose the charming bread and butter notes we were always exchanging, stationery with my still new initials, real ink, and cunning turns of phrase, bits of French, exclamation marks galore. The fan moving overhead and the heat encroaching even through the slatted blinds of the shaded room, the spice of sandalwood from the joss stick on the dresser. Out for a luncheon or a lecture or a visit to the crowded market, and then another bath when I woke from my afternoon nap, damp hair on my neck as I removed the shower cap, a haze of talcum. Still wrapped in the towel, I could feel the perspiration. Excuse me. Here we go. Prick my skin. Face powder, rouge, lipstick, and then the high-waisted cotton underpants. I hope you're laughing. The formidable cotton bra, the panty girdle with the shining diamond of brighter elastic at its center, the click of the garters, stockings slipped over the hand and held up to the light, reinforced toe and heel and top. We were careful to secure the garter just so. Too close to the nylon risked a run. You cannot imagine the troubles suggested in those days by a stocking with a run. The woman was drunk, careless, unhappy, indifferent to her husband's career, even to his affection, ready to go home. Slip, then sheath, small white dress shields pinned under each arm with tiny gold safety pins, then shoes, jewelry, a spray of perfume. I would be faint with the heat in my column of clothes by the time I came downstairs. Peter, my husband, waiting, newly shaved, handsome in his tropical weight suit, white shirt, and thin tie, having a first drink and looking a little wilted himself. And the girls we passed on the street, or who met us at the door, or who only moved across my inner eye by then in their white aoyais, were like pale leaves stirring in the humid stillness, sun-struck indications of some unseen breeze, cool, weightless, beautiful. It was at a garden party on a Sunday afternoon, early in our first month in Saigon. The party was in the elegant courtyard of a villa not far from the basilica, a lovely street lined with tamarind trees. We had only been there a few minutes ourselves when I turned to see a young family paused at the entrance, posed as if for a pretty picture beneath a swag of scarlet bougainvillea. Baby boy in the arms of the slim mother, daughter at her side, tall father in a pale suit, another engineer, I learned later. It was much later still, decades later, that I suddenly wondered, laughing to think about it, why so many engineers were needed. I was 23 then, with a bachelor's from Marymount. For a year before my marriage, I had taught kindergarten at a parish school in Harlem, but my real vocation in those days, my aspiration, was to be a helpmeet for my husband. That was the word I used. It was, in fact, the word my own father had used, taking both my gloved hands in his as we waited for the wedding guests to file into our church in Yonkers. This was in the bride's waiting room, a small chamber well off the vestibule. I recall a tiny stained glass window, a kneeling bench for last-minute prayer, I suppose, a box of tissues for last-minute tears, on a shelf under an ornate mirror, and the two brocade chairs where we sat. The cool odor of old stone and the fresh flowers in my bouquet. My father took both my hands and held them together on the wide tulle skirt of my wedding dress, which even in the dim light of the tiny room was winking with seed pearls. He said, "Be a helpmeet to your husband, be the jewel in his crown." I said, "I will." Thank you.
This was such a fascinating and unknown world for me to walk into. And your character, Patricia, and I suppose you, as the author, have this very accurate sense, that most of us have no idea what this was like. And you had to create this world that lacked certain awarenesses that we have now about what was actually going on. Was it hard to imagine yourself into this world, this distant world, and also to preserve the innocence of the characters, the lack of awareness of the characters of what was actually happening?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. That the risk, I think, of writing not necessarily historical fiction, I'm never quite sure what that term means. If I'm writing about yesterday, was it historical fiction? But to write about a time and a place, but a time that you haven't actually experienced, there's that risk of presentism, of seeing a past in the context of the present rather than in its own context, when things were unknown, when attitudes were shaped in a certain way, and especially with a narrator who's looking back, as Tricia is doing in the first part of the novel. So I was really aware of not applying, or trying not to apply too heavily, the sense of, don't these people see what's coming? Don't these people hear how naive they are? Don't they know how ridiculous girdles and garters and stockings in Saigon when it's 101 degrees? I actually had a young copy editor flag that section that I read and said, "Really, women? Are you sure women wore stockings in Saigon?" And because I don't understand, why, So there is that sense. Of course, nobody would be that foolish, but of course, this was a different time and a different place. The hardest part for me was actually the politics, because I can sort of bridge the gap between Tricia's generation and my own, from my own experience and from experience of older sisters, of friends of mine, or my mother and my aunts, but not to judge too harshly someone like Tricia's husband, who believes so fully that what he is doing in Vietnam in 1963 is God's work, and not to trivialize that or try to prove his stupidity in order to prove the author's brilliance, but rather to imagine myself into his logic of why he would be so dedicated, that he would, as a working class kid from Yonkers, who just happens to be smart and is working his way out of the working class, would join the CIA in the early 60s to save the world from communism.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. It reminded me that you say something wonderful in the book about first-generation Irish Americans. You say it was, quote, "no pleasure for them in making lesser mortals feel inferior." Is that a sensibility, a cultural value that you bring to your work, in not judging your characters and being
generous to them and judging them on their own terms?
Well, I hope so. You know, I can be very judgy. We all can in real life. And I think as a reader, I go to fiction, and I want my certainties to be disturbed. I want that person, that type, who I think I know and I understand, to be spun by the writer into something brand new, someone I didn't know and didn't fully understand. I like that challenge as a reader. And I also think it's, you know, there is that sense of a writer being generous to characters. Why would you create a character just to make fun of the character? Why would you create a character just to show, again, how stupid the character is and how brilliant the creator must be, rather than trying to make that attempt to see a human being unlike any other in a particular drama, in a particular time and place, and to leave yourself out of it. I was saying earlier today, I've been haunted by the term unselfing, which is something that Iris Murdoch uses a lot in relation to the value of art, any art. It allows us to unself. Forget yourself, unload yourself, and enter into either the character or the painting or the music. And I find that I miss that in a lot of contemporary reading that I'm doing. I hear a lot of authors saying, you and I both know this guy's a jerk, right? And he doesn't, rather than unselfing and entering into a life, not knowing what you might find or what attitudes you might have to leave behind.
In the afternoon, you talked about reading Graham Greene's The Quiet American, and the main character sees a couple of young women, young American women, on assignment of some kind, having jobs in Saigon, and he talks about how simple and clean that they are, and of course, you know, it's kind of a revelation that these women that, you know, might be dismissed by another observer actually are these rich, you know, complex, complicated characters. The men are not so complicated in this book.
I don't know.
The men honestly seem kind of simple. Some of them are quite bland. Some are saintly. One of them may be the devil himself.
Yes, thank you.
So, what's that about? Do women have richer lives and richer? I'm willing to believe that that's possible than the men. So.
Well, you know, the risk, and I think I was very aware of this from the beginning, of writing about this time. I mean, this is not a war story. It's not about the Vietnam War. It's about 1963, Americans in Vietnam in 1963, and the aftermath for the next generation. But of course, you're aware that war stories are intriguing and kind of the best. You know, the blood and the guts and the life on the line, and buddies dying for one another is wonderful material for a fiction writer. And I have read and admired so many Vietnam War stories. So I think I may have been, well, if I'm not writing about the war, and I'm not writing about buddies, and I'm not writing about GIs doing drugs and mowing down the enemy, or the aftermath of that, and how these young guys dealt with this terrible time in their life, I'm writing about spouses who played tennis and brought lollipops to children's hospitals. So I suspect I was aware that the men better stay out of the room because they might start talking too much and mansplaining things like communism, you know. I'm sure one of my favorite plays is Tom Stoppard's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, which is sort of, you know, what goes on backstage during Hamlet. And I always loved that notion of, we know who the heroes are, and we know who the drama is happening to, but what about the guys in the background? What about the characters that just walk on and walk off? And in some ways, this novel is about the characters who were just there. So I confess I didn't want the men taking over, because they will do that. And especially of this age. There is one scene when they're gathered and the men are talking about the Buddhist monk who has just set himself on fire, and the women are all just quietly listening. So I gave them that scene. But it's not about they're there, but it's not about them necessarily, although I do think the young GI, young in the early part of the book, and then as an old man later in the book, Dominic, is the pivotal character in the book. So there's that.
There's so much scheming and maneuvering among the women, and it felt in some ways so exotic to me. There are so many exchanges where a simple word or gesture can be an assertion of rank or a subtle put down. And my wife, who's here in the audience, I didn't see her initially, but now I see her, said, "This is Mean Girls," And so is this Mean Girl, and other folks who bought books at the afternoon session also brought up Mean Girls. Is this Mean Girls circa 1962?
There is, yes, if you allow Mean Girls to also have existential crises and deep thoughts about doing good in the world, which I bet they do. Just they don't always get credit for that. I mean, the confine, these women, and I've heard from so many readers who have been in similar circumstances, young wives at this time. I live outside DC, so one of the reasons, after Graham Greene, one of the reasons I wanted to write this book, because I was running into, in casual conversation, so many women who were on the periphery of what we think of as historic events, as spouses, as State Department spouses, or military spouses, or young women who just went off as secretaries because they wanted to have an adventure. And the refrain I would always hear was, "Oh, I was just taking care of the household and the children and doing my little charities. My husband was doing the really interesting stuff." And that's where you take a pause and say, having the children, taking care of them, doing your little charity work, which meant that mostly you were working with children, and in many cases, children who were victims of war. No, what you were doing is you were standing up against the injustice and the suffering in the world, and you were perpetuating the race. I don't think your husband was doing anything near that interesting. And so that, that is that's the part that I felt when we know the Mean Girls, and we even know this milieu. We know the strictures for women in America in the 1950s and the early 1960s, before the women's movement. 63 is also when Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique. So the world, the culture was well aware, or at least becoming aware, of how confining women's lives were. But I guess in some ways I also wanted to say, but weren't they also rich in a way that we haven't paid attention to?
You make us very conscious of the cultural divide between the old money Anglicans and the rising Catholics from working class backgrounds. Can you talk about the importance of that?
Yes, yeah. Again, to maybe write against type, because, again, one of the categories that such women are put in as white saviors, white women of privilege, doing small, silly things to alleviate the suffering that they saw, as Charlene does, bringing lollipops and little toys to burn children in a burn unit in Saigon. So there, there's that sense of the silliness of what these women were up to. And I think in some way chipping away at that women of privilege was one way. These are also women working their way from working class families into the middle and upper middle class. And such work, number one, made them feel, someone like Tricia made her feel she was in a completely different milieu. Now she was hanging out with generals and their spouses and people with money. But also that very American hope to find your way up and your children up even further. And that played very much in her role as helpmeet. It wasn't helpmeet so that your husband can be a successful plumber. It was helpmeet so that your smart son who got a degree on the GI Bill and then ended up in law school can move you up into the next class.
So I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to turn it over to all of you. We certainly need to talk about the idea of absolution, about seeking release from sin or guilt or punishment. Your characters, most of your characters, perhaps all your characters, want this in some way, despite their selfish impulses, their faults. I would venture that even the devil character, the filthy doctor who sleeps in the jungle, the devil himself appears to be seeking absolution. It's a deep human need, and I'm not sure that it's really given this kind of treatment in much fiction. It may be a universal need or hunger. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about that?
Gosh, yes. So the story for the title, I had a very dear friend who's no longer with us, Monsignor, who was a New York wonderful priest in a parish in Queens for many years. Studied at Columbia, was a brilliant guy, actually, and read everything, saw everything. We were friends for years. And I was working on the novel and had dinner with Monsignor George. He was this great big guy, and he always kind of looked down at me, literally, not figuratively. And he said, so do you have a title for this book that you're working on? And I said, yeah, I'm sort of thinking of calling it Absolution. And he looked at me and said, that's a terrible title. And it kind of took my breath away, because most writers, when they say, I'm kind of thinking of this, is pretty much, I'm stuck with this, and I hope it's a good title. It's a terrible title. And I said, well, why? And he said, because nobody really understands what it means. People think of absolution and they think of get out of jail free card. We're just going to pretend that didn't happen. We're going to pretend that all your sins are erased. And he was saying it's much more complex than that. And he launched into a long, wonderful exegesis that I wish I had recorded about the notion, about the sacrament in the Catholic Church, about the notion of absolution. But then he said, the root of the word is to set free. And the action to set free always involves two actors. There is the one who is set free, and there is also the one who sets free. It cannot happen in solitary confinement. It's between two. It always takes two. Someone has to be willing to set free, and someone has to want to be set free. And by that time, I realized that the novel was full of all these twinning characters. There are literal twins. There are pairs of friends and workers and there's a Christ figure and a devil figure. So the minute he said that, I thought, now I understand what the twinning is all about. It is about this very essential human impulse to turn, but it has to be to turn to someone. Of course, for a Catholic priest, God is the other person. But here on earth, it's that to turn to one other person and to ask for absolution and to have that other person in turn granted. And this novel is a call and response between two characters, Tricia and Charlene, Tricia's friend and nemesis daughter. And in many ways, the exchange is both of them asking to be set free from mistakes in the past, from misapprehensions, from what seemed like a good idea at the time that turned out not to be, from bitterness, and in some ways, from the times that they lived in.
It's your chance. Jen has a mic in the back.
I can bring a mic around.
Okay, I'm going to turn my mic off so I don't create disturbances.
This is a rather simplistic question, but I'm really just curious. I felt the sweat and the heat and the feeling that you described. The scriptures are beautiful. Have you been there? Or how did you capture the atmosphere in Vietnam at that time?
Thank you. Yeah, no, I haven't. When I began the novel, I thought it would be my opportunity to pretend to be Graham Greene and to become a world traveler and to go to Ho Chi Minh City and take that tour of Vietnam that I've wanted to take since I was a young writer. I knew I had to get writing first. I had to know the characters, I had to know the story so that any trip I would know what I was looking for. So by the time I got enough of the story written so that I could go to Vietnam, COVID came along. So I thought, well, I can put this aside until whenever, if ever, we can travel again. But I very quickly realized none of us can go to Saigon in 1963. It ain't available. Saigon isn't really literally on a map anymore, but I'm writing about not just a place, but a time, and I'm writing about a very particular experience of the place and time. So what I did, I think of that long, crazy 2020 summer, I went to my shelves and I reread every Vietnam book that I loved, and most of them were, of course, written by men and about the war. Something is one, Tim O'Brien's books right away, go back, I went back to those. Tree of Smoke, Dennis Johnson's wonderful thick. And I didn't know what I was looking for, but I realized that fiction, good fiction, is more immersive than tourism. There are, in my memory bank, rooms from novels that I know better than rooms I have lived in. There are scenes, there are landscapes that I have read that I know better than the landscapes that I've actually lived in when I was distracted by being alive. So I knew I could find whatever I really needed through fiction first. And then, as I wanted to get my facts straight, which is important, I did look to see if there were any memoirs by women who were in any way like my characters, and there weren't, which told me something. These were not women who thought their experiences were worth sharing. They were just helpmeets. The men were writing memoirs all the time. And certainly, again, once it comes to combat, that's a different experience altogether. So I did read some, go online and read some blogs from kids who had been in Saigon at the time, again, just to get those little facts that you don't want to get wrong. you're not all about getting them right, because I'm not a journalist and this is not a history. But by that time I knew the characters well enough and could pass everything through their eyes and through their sensibilities. So in many ways they told me what I needed to put down to make their life experience vivid on the page.
I thought the use of the Barbie dolls was fascinating in the book, and it kind of told the story, the cultural divide story, taking advantage of the Vietnamese women as well. And I just wondered how you came up with using the Barbie dolls.
Yeah, well, that was my Proustian moment. So living inside the Beltway, having casual conversations with women of this generation who were now grandmothers, most of them, and hearing sort of inadvertently they would tell you stories about the exotic places they had lived when they were young wives and mothers. And it was at one such occasion, we were standing, a group of us was standing around, you know, drinking, chatting, and there was a woman who had been a young wife in Saigon in about 1960 or 61, when Barbie dolls were really just coming out. And again, I don't know even how the conversation came around to this. I certainly wasn't asking, this was not on my mind at all. She mentioned that when their dressmakers would leave, the women in her cohort would gather the scraps and they would sew Barbie doll clothes from them for the children who lived there, or to send back home because Barbie was. And when she said this, I had a flashback to my own childhood when I was sent, probably my mother was trying to do good, and there was some lonely kid in the neighborhood who didn't have any friends, and my mother decided I needed to go and play Barbies with this girl, because I don't know who she was and I don't recall her being a friend, but I recall being on a play date with my little Barbie case, and this girl took out her Barbie, and her Barbie was wearing what I know now is an ao yai. I just thought it was this beautiful silk, exotic. I probably thought it was Chinese or something, and I remember I wanted it. You know, it was, because those were the days when homemade Barbie doll clothes were still acceptable. And I had completely forgotten about it until this woman mentioned it all these years later in Washington, D.C. at this party. And so I had been, you know, playing with this idea of writing a story about such women and you know, going toe-to-toe with Graham Greene in The Quiet American, and I thought, so what, now I'm going to sit down, now I need to write an origin story. How is it that in the early 1960s, a girl in Elmont, Long Island had a Barbie doll wearing an ao yai? How would that have happened? And so I had my first scene, and there you go. And then the characters followed along.
Alice, I want to say that I have been a fan of yours for many years, and I've recognized several of the Irish Catholic members of my family. But I wanted to mention, #1 on the New York Times fiction bestseller is Kristen Hannah's book, The Women, also focusing on the women's experience in Vietnam. A very, very different book from yours, but both calling attention to this really overlooked part of the Vietnam experience. And I wondered if you had any reaction to her book.
I haven't read it yet. I'm certainly aware of it. Her story, as far as is a war story. It's about nurses in combat. And when I was doing my research, those memoirs you can find, and they're horrible, harrowing stories. I'm sure she was able to take good advantage of that. But there have been a number of memoirs published by American women who were nurses in the most awful combat zones of Vietnam. I wasn't writing those, to me, that's the Tim O'Brien, it's just another side, another point of view, which is wonderful, but of war. I never set out to write a war story. I think I'm more interested in, yes, Vietnam is the time, and 63 is the time and the place that begins the novel, but what I hope the novel really is about things that are not confined to that time and place. Women's work, doing good in the world. How do you determine what's good in the world? In this instance, that's what storytellers do. They put it in a time and a place. We were talking earlier, I see novels, two things, the experience of the novel, that's the plot, that's the story, that's the characters, that's the setting, but then meaning in the novel. And that I think every reader legitimately can ask even the most wonderful, talented, celebrated writer in the first 2 or 3 pages of any fabulous novel, every reader has a right to say, wait a minute, why are you telling me this? And the why, for me, is why I write. Not just to tell you the story. You can find anecdotes, you can find those women and talk to them about their experience. You can certainly find memoirs of every aspect of any war, recent war, especially Vietnam, which has such a rich literary history. But that's not what I'm out to do. I'd rather just use those things to ask the questions I feel like we all need to be asking ourselves. How do we do good in the world? How do we keep that good from turning evil? Are good intentions enough? And are we crazy when we shake our fist at suffering, or should we just say, those are the breaks, that's what it is to be human? So I think we just come at literature in a different way. That's why I don't understand historical fiction. It's all history.
Maybe 2 or 3 more questions? Yeah.
A little bit off topic, but I'm 3 years older than you, and I grew up in Elmont. So I'm just wondering what school you went to, and maybe what street you lived on.
Argo Village, Emily Avenue.
Okay.
All right, what street?
I lived on Savoy, off of Hempstead Turnpike, near the Luna.
Okay, I got that, right. I went to St. Boniface.
Oh, okay, that was my church. Yeah.
Right. 1st through 8, and then I went to Sacred Heart Academy in Hempstead.
I went to Albany Memorial. Elmont Memorial. Right?
Elmont Memorial, yes. When I was in 8th grade, the nuns would point over to Elmont Memorial and say, "You'll end up there if you don't shape up." The den of iniquity that Elmont Memorial High School was.
And then I came here, graduated in 1980 and stayed.
That's great.
As half of Long Island came to you.
Right. Well, I went to Oswego, but I didn't stay. Thank you.
I feel like I'm interrupting a St. Boniface reunion. That was pretty cool. Can you tell us what your parents thought when you informed them you wanted to be a novelist? And what was your first job after college in publishing, the story you shared at dinner?
Well, my parents loved me a great deal, and they were good, hardworking, first-generation Irish Catholics. My father was actually a Goldwater Republican on top of it all, so go figure. So they were kindly dismayed when I even began to mention wanting to be a fiction writer. And their suggestion was go to Katie Gibbs, which was the secretarial school, learn to take shorthand, get your typing speed up, and get a nice job in a publishing company. If you like books so much, you'll have health insurance. My father said when I did get a job in publishing, but it was a vanity publisher, where people pay to have their books published, which I was able to use as a setting for my first novel. So nothing is lost on us fiction writers. But after that, I decided I still really wanted to write fiction, and went off to get a master's at the University of New Hampshire. And when I told my father that I had been accepted and I was going to go, he said, "You already have 1 degree you can't do anything with. Why would you want 2? Out of the goodness of their hearts." Question?
I wanted to talk about the 9th hour, because I feel like there's a lot of similar themes. And I just wanted to tell you that when Sister Jean describes what it's going to be like, and you take off your hot curly coat and all of your sins, basically, and run through the sheets, it was just the most amazing example. I actually typed it out, attributed it to you, so that I can read it over and over.
A vision of heaven. We all need them, right?
So, do you have more to say on this subject? Because this thing is also that kind of thing. Shedding your sins and understanding what's going to happen.
Yeah, well, I think it's an occupational habit of a writer who was raised and still trying to be a Catholic or even a Christian, that the notion of self-sacrifice finds its way into your work, whether you intend it to or not, to give one's life for another. And that was Sister Jean. I mean, that was what she was all about. And I think probably there was some resonance of that when I was composing this novel. You know, in D.C., the Vietnam Wall is well, when we have visitors to our house, it's people of my generation especially, it's the place they want to go. When our kids were growing up, we always went down to the mall very early on Memorial Day, and we would always walk the wall. And it's always astonished me that no matter what's going on, you know, the motorcycles can be all over the place, and the president can be coming back from Arlington Cemetery on Memorial Day morning, and visitors galore. When you walk along the Vietnam Wall, there's kind of a cathedral hush every single time. And especially, you know, the beauty of the way that wall, you know, ascends and then descends with the names, and you just try to take in the names, and you see the people walking with you, just trying to take in the names, and I don't know if I make this up or I hear it and it's my inner voice or it's literally happening, but it has struck me many times that as the wall descends and you see you're getting to the end of it and you're getting back into the noisy world, there always seems to be a refrain of what for. Vietnam, I don't think this happens at the World War II Memorial. But the Vietnam Memorial, you hear that, what was it for? You're overwhelmed by these names. And again, being born and bred Christian and prayer being, you know, my first poetry, it always makes me think of John, you know, no greater love than this, to give up your life for your friends. And I think that refrain kind of haunted and my trying to capture this time and place in this novel. So that essentially for me the novel becomes, do we believe that? Does that notion, no greater love than this, than to lay down your life for your friends, does that have real value? Do we believe that? And if we do believe it, so what? What do we do with it? And essentially, I see that the novel became for me two instances, two characters who give up their lives for their friends, not in combat, which would have been the easy and obvious choice, but through the course of their lives. A young Vietnamese woman who makes the Barbie clothes, who has been manipulated somewhat by these American women, but also taken care of and helped in some ways. At the very end of the book, the reader finds out that she has gone back to the leper colony to be with a beloved cousin. In other words, given up her own healthy life for someone she loves whose life is going to be very short. And then Dominic, who is a young, happy-go-lucky, a little bit cliched, sort of...
Recall him cliche.
Well, no, but he's, if he would be the pretty young nurse if this was a novel all about the men.
He is the Buddha, right?
Yes, right. He's the Buddha. He's the American Buddha. But later in his life, he, as an aging man, gives up his life for his adopted son who has Down syndrome, who is not going to have a long life, and yet he gives up. So, it is that notion that I find myself going back to and maybe illustrating, or illustrating isn't quite the right word, maybe simply proposing to the reader, asking the reader, let's both think about this. It's that, that twinning thing again, that it takes two to find absolution. Let's think about, is there any value in that notion? No greater love than to lay down your life for your friends. And Sister Jean would say, it works because there's heaven. Because that's your reward for doing it. But what about the rest of us who aren't so sure about this heaven stuff? Do we find that valuable is that great love worth anything? And I come back to that. It's just because I don't have the answer. I just want to propose to readers, can we think about these characters and think about that notion?
And the reference at the beginning of this conversation was to The Ninth Hour, your previous novel, which presents nuns as fully human, and right, not as caricatures, as just living, breathing, complex human beings.
Yeah, nuns needed that.
So we're going to take one last question. Before we take it, if you didn't get to ask a question, you can do so on the signing line. You'll have that opportunity. You'll have an opportunity to talk with Alice. If you have a very long story, you might want to wait at the end of the line so that folks are not waiting behind you for you to finish. So we invite you to purchase books, and if you have books already, that's fine too. And if you have no books, that's also fine. And we'll be doing this. I believe Jen wanted to do it outside. Yeah, we'll in the Great Hall. So we'll be doing it outside the auditorium. So we'll try to spirit Alice out of here before she's waylaid by all of her admirers, and get her to that table. Last question.
Hi, Alice. I love your work. And I hope this question isn't too much of a crash to earth after all this spiritual stuff.
We may need it.
I'm interested in the kind of the intersection between creativity and business, which is publishing. And I'd be interested to know kind of how you got started. And then once you got successful, how is the pressure been to either produce more or to turn out at a certain rate, or is it going to be the same, or we want more of this? Can you tell me a little bit about your journey?
Sure. Sure. I'll try not to make this too long. You do want to get to bed tonight. I have been blessed. I've been very fortunate. I went off to, as I was saying, back to the narrative. I went off to the University of New Hampshire to get my master's, studied with wonderful writers there. One of them was a marvelous writer named Mark Smith, he had 4 daughters. And I think that's why he made me take myself seriously as a writer, because he did. After I left UNH and moved down to New York, he said, if you're going to take yourself seriously, you need to have a literary agent. I didn't know what that meant. And he said, and I'm going to recommend to my agent's partner your work. And once I do that, you have to be brave and you have to show her the novel that you're working on. That was my first novel. Harriet Wasserman was Saul Bellows' agent at the time. I was completely intimidated. I told Mark, yes, I would do that. I was so intimidated, I slid an envelope with the first 50 pages of my novel under her office door and ran away. And I thought, if she reads it and says, this woman, he's crazy, she's crazy, she never has to call me, we can just pretend it didn't happen. She called me, and her first question was, how many more pages do you have? I said, I have another 50, 100 pages, don't have 101. She said, what kind of editor do you want to work with? Does it make a difference to you if you work with a female editor or a male editor? And at the time, I was like, blind and illiterate would be fine. Me working with an editor, fabulous. And she said, there's a young editor at Houghton Mifflin named Jonathan Galassi, and I really think he's going to love your work, and I'm going to send it to him. And a week later, Jonathan Galassi said, I want to meet you, and I want to read the whole thing. And I had a contract. And he has been my editor for every book. No pressure. Now it's kind of like this old marriage. It's like no pressure is, well, does that mean neglect? Do you really appreciate me? He finishes my sentences, all that. And I have a wonderful publishing house, Farrar Straus. Jonathan left Houghton Mifflin, went to Random House and published my first, and then ended up at Farrar Straus, where he became president and publisher over the course of our careers together. His refrain is always, you know your books better than I do, and when it's ready, it's ready. So I really haven't felt, except maybe from my husband who wants me to publish more quickly. Other than that, I've never, I've been so fortunate to just go off and do what I do, and discover what I can, and put those sentences down and turn them around, and when they're ready, I've had a wonderful publisher in Farrar Straus. So it's a happy publishing story.
So you don't need to answer this, but before we applaud, what's next?
I don't know when it's going to come out. I recently answered a question like that for a piece that I think is in the Times Magazine or something. I had a great conversation with this reporter, and then she said, just send me a paragraph about what you're working on. So there are sort of 3 genres of novel that occur to me I just don't get. One is science fiction. I've taught so many young writers who love science fiction, and they're always recommending and saying, oh, you're going to love this, and I just don't. The other one is murder mysteries. Murder mysteries, it's like somebody died, this is horrible. I don't care about the detective. I want to know, let's mourn for this dead body, and detective stories never do that. So detective stories just don't speak to me. And the third category is novels about novelists, because I think novelists are, we don't do anything. We sit in chairs and write sentences. And every once in a while we get sent out to talk about sitting in chairs and writing sentences. So those 3 genres are, through my career, books that I really feel like I have not given full respect to because they just don't speak to me. So I have vowed that I'm going to write in all 3 genres. And I've already started 2. I won't tell you which 2, and the other one I'm edging towards. So it's going to be awful. And the nice thing is, if they are awful, which they probably will be, I can say, well, these aren't the kind of books I like to read anyway. So I'm done, right?
Let's applaud the sheer contrariness of her ambitions. Alice McDermott, we'll meet you out in the Great Hall if you'd like to get something signed, and thank you so much for coming.